This story is titled, My Wife Cheated, I Kicked Her Out, and then her affair partner showed up. And that's how it went down. Hey everyone. Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. Hi Reddit, I'm a 36-year-old guy, and I'm here to share something that's been weighing on me for a while. I'm not looking for advice. I've already made my decisions. Maybe someone out there can relate or find my story interesting. It's about my marriage to Samantha, a 34-year-old woman I met almost a decade ago. At the time, I thought she was the love of my life. Turns out I didn't know her as well as I thought. I met Samantha 8 years ago at this high-end men's clothing store I used to shop at. I'm not going to name the place because they don't deserve to be dragged into this mess, but let's just say it was one of those stores where they greet you by name if you're a regular. I had started going there because I needed good suits for work and business events, and honestly, I liked the vibe. Samantha worked there as a sales associate, and she was absolutely magnetic. She had this energy about her, like she could light up a room just by walking into it. She knew how to make every customer feel like they were the most important person in the store, and her charm wasn't just good for sales, it was contagious. She had this way of remembering little details, like what tie I wore to my last fitting, or the color of the cufflinks I bought for a client meeting. It felt personal, like she cared. I started going there more often, not because I needed another suit. Trust me, I already had enough, but because I wanted to see her. I'd go in for something small, like a pocket square or new socks, and we'd end up chatting for way longer than I'd planned. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to ask her out. She said yes, and things just clicked. Samantha told me about her upbringing, how she came from a modest background, and always dreamed of something bigger. She wanted to travel, have a beautiful home, and live the kind of life she saw in magazines. I admired that about her back then. She wasn't shy about her ambitions, and I liked that she wasn't pretending to be. We dated for about a year before we got married. During that time, I was climbing the corporate ladder, and Samantha was still working at. She was really good at her job, and it was clear she enjoyed the perks, meeting interesting people, staying on top of fashion trends, and occasionally scoring free merchandise. But as our relationship grew more serious, she started talking about quitting. She said she didn't see herself as just a sales girl forever. She wanted more. And to be honest, I didn't mind the idea. I was in a position where I could comfortably support us, and I wanted her to feel like she could pursue her dreams. So when we got married, Samantha quit her job at the store. She said she was ready to move on to bigger things and that working retail was beneath her now. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I was just happy to provide for her. I thought I was doing the right thing as a husband, making sure she didn't have to worry about money or a demanding job. But looking back, that was the moment things started to shift. At first, it was subtle. She wanted to upgrade her wardrobe to match her new life, which seemed reasonable, but her taste quickly escalated. She wasn't interested in nice clothes from department stores. She wanted designer brands. Gucci, Chanel, Louis Vuitton, you name it. She wanted it. What started as a couple of splurges here and there turned into monthly shopping trips, and she wasn't shy about the price tags. I figured it was a phase, maybe just her way of celebrating her new chapter. But it wasn't. It became her identity. She started posting everything on social media, pictures of her outfits, luxury handbags, fancy dinners, and curated snapshots of our life that made everything look picture perfect. It was like she wanted to project this image of being part of the elite, even though I knew we weren't quite there. Sure, I was doing well, but we weren't swimming in money. She got really into charity events and social clubs, which I thought was great at first. She said it was her way of giving back and building connection. But over time, I noticed she was more interested in being seen at these events than actually contributing. She'd spend hours getting ready, making sure her outfit was Instagram-worthy, and then spend most of the night mingling with people she barely knew. It was like she was chasing validation instead of genuinely enjoying herself. There were signs I should have paid more attention to. For starters, Samantha started looking down on people she used to work with. She used to talk about how much she loved her job at the clothing store and how close she was to her coworkers. But after quitting, she acted like they were beneath her. She'd say things like, "Can you believe so-and-so is still working there?" I could never go back to that. It was also around this time that she started criticizing me in small, subtle ways. She'd make comments about how I dressed, even though I'd always been the one who cared about style. She'd say things like, "You should really invest in a better watch," or, "Don't you think it's time to upgrade your car?" It wasn't outright rude, but it felt like she was comparing me to the people she admired at these events. Another thing was how secretive she became. She'd always been open about her schedule and plans, but now she'd casually mention things like, "Oh, I'm meeting a friend for lunch," without giving any details. When I asked who she was meeting, she'd brush it off or change the subject. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it planted a seed of doubt. I know this all probably sounds like hindsight bias, but it's hard not to connect the dots now. Samantha had always been ambitious, but somewhere along the way, her ambition turned into entitlement. She wasn't the woman I fell in love with anymore. She was more focused on appearances and status than the life we were building together. I didn't realize it then, but I was already losing her. I just didn't know how bad it would get. So, here's how it went down. FYI, Samantha was always better with tech than me. We had one of those Amazon Alexa devices in the house that she loved to use. I barely touched it, except for the occasional timer or to play some music while I worked. Samantha, on the other hand, relied on it for everything. Grocery lists, reminders, even planning her events. She'd talk to Alexa like it was her assistant. I didn't mind. It made her life easier, and honestly, I never thought much of it. But that little gadget ended up being the thing that exposed everything. It was a Friday night, and Samantha said she had a late charity meeting. This wasn't unusual. She had gotten really involved with a few organizations over the past year, and she loved to tell me how important her work there was. She left the house around 8 p.m., dressed in one of her expensive dresses, hair and makeup done like she was attending some gala. I didn't question it. I figured she wanted to make a good impression. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when Alexa suddenly chimed in with a notification. Reminder, meeting with Trevor at 9 p.m., the Capitol Grill. I froze. The Capitol Grill? I'd been there a handful of times for business lunch. It's one of those upscale steakhouses where you don't show up unless you're celebrating something or trying to impress someone. Not exactly the kind of place you'd go for a charity meeting. And Trevor? I didn't know any Trevor in her life. I sat there staring at Alexa like it had just dropped a bomb on me. My mind was racing. Was this some kind of mistake? Maybe it was work-related, but if it was, why hadn't she mentioned it? And why the secrecy? Then it hit me. I knew the manager there. Let's call him Mike. And he had helped me out before with a last-minute reservation for a client dinner. I still had his number saved. Without thinking too much, I called him. "Hey, Mike," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "I know this is kind of weird, but I need a favor. My wife might be at the Capitol Grill tonight, and I just need to know if she's actually there." Mike hesitated. Is everything okay?" "Not really," I admitted. "If you see her, just let me know. And if you can, maybe snap a picture or two. I need to know what's going on." He paused again, then said, "All right, I'll keep an eye out. What's she wearing?" I described her dress, and Mike agreed to call me if he spotted her. I hung up and immediately started pacing the living room. I didn't know what to think. Part of me was hoping it was all a misunderstanding, but deep down, I already knew. Around 9:30, my phone buzzed. It was Mike. "She's here," he said. "She's with some guy. A younger guy." My stomach dropped. Mike texted me a picture, and there she was, sitting across from a guy who looked like he couldn't be older than his late 20s. He had that casual, cocky vibe, rolled-up sleeves, a flashy watch, and this smug grin like he thought he owned the place. Samantha was laughing, leaning in close, and looking happier than I'd seen her in years. "Do you want me to keep taking pictures?" Mike asked. "Yeah," I said. "Get whatever you can." Over the next 20 minutes, Mike sent me more photos and even a short video. In the video, they were leaving the restaurant together, walking close enough that their hands brushed. Samantha was smiling like she didn't have a care in the world. I felt sick. The next day, I couldn't shake the images from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Samantha with that guy. I remembered all the little signs I had ignored, the secretive behavior, the subtle criticisms, the way she always seemed distracted lately. It all added up. I knew I needed more than just a few photos. So, in the meantime, I tried to act normal. Samantha came home that night acting like everything was fine. She told me the charity meeting went well, and even threw in some fake details about the event. I nodded along, pretending to listen, but inside, I was boiling. This is where things really started to come together. By now, I was past the stage of hoping this was some kind of misunderstanding. Between the pictures Mike sent me from the Capitol Grill and the little breadcrumbs Samantha had been leaving, I knew something was up. But I wanted undeniable, ironclad proof before I made my move. That's where the private investigator came in. When I hired the PI, I didn't know what to expect. I'd never done anything like that before, but I figured this guy was a pro, and I just needed to sit back and let him do his thing. I gave him everything I knew: Samantha's schedule, the places she liked to go, and the info Mike had given me about Trevor. It didn't take long for the PI to start digging up dirt. Within a week, he handed me a file that would make anyone's blood boil. It was packed with photos, receipts, and detailed reports of Samantha's escapades. She wasn't just sneaking around with Trevor once or twice. This was a full-blown affair, and it had been going on for months. First, there were the pictures, dozens of them. Samantha and Trevor meeting up at fancy restaurants, walking hand in hand down the street, and even sitting on a park bench laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. There were also shots of them leaving a boutique hotel, looking way too comfortable with each other for it to be anything innocent. Then came the receipt. Samantha had been paying for everything: dinners, hotel stays, and even gifts. The PI managed to track down a purchase she made at a high-end men's store. She bought Trevor a designer watch that probably cost more than my first car. And how was she funding all this? With my money, of course. Every swipe of her card, every dollar spent, came from the accounts I worked hard to build. It didn't stop there. The PI found Trevor's social media accounts, and let me tell you, this guy was a piece of work. He was one of those wannabe influencers who thought he was hot stuff because he had a few thousand followers. His posts were full of shirtless selfies, motivational quotes, and pictures of him partying at clubs. He didn't have a real job, but he seemed to have no problem living it up, thanks to Samantha. I couldn't believe it. Here I was, busting my ass to provide a comfortable life for my wife, and she was using it to bankroll this guy's lifestyle. The audacity was unbelievable. Trevor was at least 10 years younger than Samantha. Judging by his Instagram, he was the kind of guy who thought he was destined to be famous, but hadn't done anything to earn it. He worked as a bartender at some trendy cocktail lounge downtown, a place Samantha had started frequenting when she claimed she was going to networking events. The more I learned about him, the more ridiculous it all seemed. Samantha, my wife who insisted on only eating at Michelin-star restaurants and wearing designer clothes, was running around with a guy who lived in a studio apartment and posted TikToks about hustle culture. He couldn't even afford dinner at Applebee's. It wasn't just insulting, it was pathetic. By this point, I had all the proof I needed. The file from the PI was rock solid, and there was no way Samantha could talk her way out of it. But I didn't want to just confront her in private. No, that would have been too easy. Samantha thrived on her image. She loved being seen as the elegant, charitable wife who had it all together. If she wanted to play that game, I was going to make sure everyone saw the truth. I started planning my next move. This wasn't just about catching her. It was about making sure she couldn't walk away from this easily. For the next week, I played the role of the oblivious husband. Samantha went about her usual routine, acting like everything was fine. She'd leave the house for her charity events and come back late, always with some elaborate story about the people she'd met or the connections she'd made. I nodded along, pretending to believe her, but inside I was seething. I knew she was still seeing Trevor because the PI was keeping tabs on her. They met up at least twice that week, once for dinner and once for drinks at Trevor's lounge. The PI even managed to snap a photo of Samantha kissing him in the parking lot in his beat-up car. At that point, I wasn't even shocked anymore. It was just more confirmation of what I already knew. One night, Samantha came home and casually mentioned that she had been shopping for a new dress for an upcoming gala. She was so smug about it, talking about how she needed to make an impression and how people in her circle expect a certain standard. It took everything in me not to laugh in her face. Here she was, trying to keep up appearances, while I had a folder full of evidence that could blow up her entire world. I decided I wasn't going to wait much longer. The proof was piling up, and I was ready to make my move. I knew I couldn't just confront her in private. Samantha had spent years cultivating this image of herself as the perfect wife, the high society do-gooder, the woman everyone wanted to be. So I decided her downfall needed an audience. She wanted the spotlight. Fine, I'd give it to her. I started planning the party about a week after the PI handed me everything. I invited everyone who mattered to her, her old coworkers from the clothing store, the ones she'd looked down on after she quit, members of her charity board, and the women from her social circles who always seemed to hang on her every word. These were the people who thought Samantha was untouchable, the ones she loved to impress. I even invited a few of my own friends, just to have some backup in case things got heated. I told everyone it was a celebration of Samantha's amazing charity work and our marriage. It wasn't hard to sell. The people in her orbit loved any excuse to dress up and drink on someone else's dime. Meanwhile, I worked with my lawyer to finalize everything on the divorce front. I wanted to make sure that by the time the party happened, the paperwork was already in motion. I wasn't going to leave any room for Samantha to manipulate her way out of this. The night of the party, Samantha was in her element. She spent hours getting ready, parading around the house in her expensive dress and heels, making sure everything looked perfect. She asked me if I was excited about the party, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. "Oh, I'm definitely excited," I told her. When the guests started arriving, Samantha was glowing. She was the perfect hostess, greeting everyone at the door with that charming smile of hers, making sure everything was flowing, and chatting with all the women who idolized her. Watching her soak it all in was almost entertaining. Once everyone was settled with a drink in hand, I stood up to make a toast. Samantha looked over at me, smiling like she expected me to shower her with compliments. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "Tonight's a special night. I want to celebrate the truth, because sometimes the truth has a funny way of coming out." The room went quiet. Samantha's smile faltered, and she gave me this look, like she was trying to figure out what I meant. I could see the gears turning in her head, but it was too late. The folder from the PI was my trump card, and I wasn't afraid to use it. So, I pulled out the folder and a small remote for the projector I'd set up earlier. I clicked a button, and the first image appeared on the wall behind me, a photo of Samantha and Trevor, holding hands at the Capitol Grill. The room erupted into whispers and gasps. "This," I said, pointing to the photo, "is Samantha, my loving wife, with Trevor, a bartender she's been seeing for months." I clicked the remote again, and a video started playing. It was footage of Samantha and Trevor leaving a hotel together. They looked relaxed, smiling and laughing, like they didn't have a care in the world. I kept going, showing receipts for the dinners and gifts she'd bought for Trevor. Every one of them paid for with my money. I even showed screenshots from the Alexa reminders she'd set to plan their little meetups. Samantha stood frozen, her face pale. When I turned to look at her, she opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. "Are you kidding me?" one of her charity friends finally said. She turned to Samantha, her face full of disbelief. "Is this for real?" Samantha tried to stammer out a defense. It's not what it looks like." I cut her off. "Save it. The evidence speaks for itself." Her old co-workers from the clothing store were whispering to each other, clearly enjoying the moment. I even heard one of them say, "Karma's a bye." Samantha looked around the room, desperate for someone to come to her defense, but no one did. Even her closest friends were too stunned to say anything. I wrapped up my speech with one final bomb. "I've already filed for divorce. There's nothing left to say." Samantha stormed out of the house, humiliated. I didn't bother stopping her. She could run if she wanted, but the damage was already done. The party didn't end there, though. Most of the guests stayed, finishing their drinks and gossiping about what had just happened. Her charity friends were especially vocal, saying things like, "I can't believe she'd do this, and I always thought she was a little too into appearances." Her old co-workers, on the other hand, looked like they were having the time of their lives. One of them even came up to me and said, "You handled that better than I would have. She always thought she was better than us." By the end of the night, I felt relieved. For months, I had been carrying this weight, trying to figure out what was happening in my marriage. Now, everything was out in the open. Samantha's facade was shattered, and there was no going back. After the chaos of the party, the next logical step was to get Samantha out of my life for good. Thankfully, the divorce process turned out to be as smooth as it could possibly be, thanks to one key decision I made years ago: the prenup. When Samantha and I were engaged, I insisted on a prenup. At the time, it was a tough conversation. She pushed back hard, saying stuff like, "Don't you trust me? And if we're getting married, why do we need something so transactional?" But I stood my ground. I explained that it wasn't about trust. It was about protecting both of us in case things ever went wrong. I'd worked hard to get where I was financially, and I wasn't going to risk it. In the end, she signed it. I think she assumed it would never come into play because she was convinced we'd be together forever. She probably thought it was just a formality, something I'd forget about over time. Fast forward to now, and that decision turned out to be the smartest one I've ever made. The morning after the party, I started throwing up her things into bags. I didn't wait for her to come back and plead her case. I wasn't interested. Then I met with my lawyer. I'd already laid the groundwork for the divorce before the confrontation, so it was just a matter of putting things into motion. My lawyer filed the papers, complete with all the evidence of Samantha's infidelity. The photos, the receipts, the private investigator's report. It was all there. A few days later, Samantha got served. I didn't tell her it was coming, so I can only imagine the shock when she opened that envelope. She didn't call me right away, which was surprising. I figured she was either in denial or scrambling to figure out her next move. When she did finally call, it was classic Samantha. First, she cried. She begged for forgiveness, saying she'd made a mistake and that we could work through it. When I didn't budge, she flipped the script. Suddenly, I was the villain for filing for divorce. She accused me of humiliating her, of setting her up to look bad in front of everyone. I kept my cool and told her the same thing every time. Talk to my lawyer. That's when she started trying to fight the prenup. Her lawyer argued that she deserved more because she had sacrificed her career to support me. She claimed that quitting her job at the clothing store had been for my benefit, and that I owed her compensation for all the hard work she put into our marriage. My lawyer shut that down immediately. The evidence of her lavish spending habits, combined with her affair, gave her zero leverage. She wasn't supporting me. She was draining me. The judge wasn't impressed with her arguments. It was like watching her try to climb a greased pole. In the end, Samantha walked away with nothing but her personal belongings and the small settlement outlined in the prenup. It wasn't much, just enough to cover some basic living expenses for a couple of months. It was laughable compared to what she had been used to. I, on the other hand, kept everything else. The house, the car, the savings, even the little things like the furniture and appliances. There was no drawn-out battle or messy back and forth. The prenup made everything clear, and there wasn't a single loophole for her to exploit. The whole process was surprisingly quick. From the moment I filed to the day it was finalized, it took just a few months. I think part of the reason it moved so fast was because Samantha didn't have the resources to drag it out. Without my money, she couldn't afford a high-powered lawyer or lengthy legal battles. When the divorce was finalized, I felt like the weight of the past few months, the lies, the betrayal, the stress, was finally gone. Samantha was no longer my problem. Even after the divorce was finalized, Samantha tried to push her luck. She emailed me a few times, accusing me of being heartless and saying I was punishing her for a mistake. She called me selfish and claimed I had ruined her life. But the truth is, Samantha ruined her own life. She made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. I didn't respond to any of her emails. There was no point. As far as I was concerned, our relationship was over the moment she chose that loser over me. By now, you'd think Samantha would have learned her lesson, but life had a few more wake-up calls in store for her. Watching her fall from grace was both satisfying and a little surreal. After the dust settled, I started hearing bits and pieces about what Samantha was up to through mutual acquaintances. One of the first things she did after the divorce was try to go back to the clothing store where we first met. I don't know if she thought she could waltz in and pick up where she left off, but apparently, she was in for a rude awakening. The store manager turned her down flat. Word about the party and the affair had gotten around, and no one wanted to take her on. The manager, who knew me back when I was a regular, even told a mutual friend that Samantha's reputation was toxic, and that they didn't want the drama she had burned bridges she didn't even know she needed. As for Trevor, he didn't stick around for long after the money dried up. The private investigators' reports had painted a clear picture of who he was, a guy who coasted on charm and good looks, jumping from one sugar mama to the next. Samantha was just another stepping stone for him. I heard through the grapevine that Samantha tried reaching out to him after the divorce, but he ghosted her. No calls, no texts, nothing. She had bankrolled his lifestyle for months, but as soon as she couldn't keep it up, he moved on to the next target. Part of me wondered if she ever realized just how little she meant to him, or if she was too delusional to see it. Without Trevor and without my financial support, Samantha's life started falling apart. She ended up renting a tiny apartment on the outskirts of town, far from the upscale neighborhoods she used to frequent. It wasn't glamorous, but it was all she could afford with her small settlement and whatever she managed to get from selling her designer items. Speaking of which, that was another blow to her ego. Samantha loved her luxury handbags, shoes, and jewelry, but she was forced to start selling them off just to make ends meet. I even heard she tried to sell one of her handbags back to a boutique she used to shop at, and they lowballed her on the offer. She had no choice but to take it. One of the most bizarre moments of this entire mess happened a few months after I was at home, minding my own business, when there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Trevor standing there. For a second, I didn't even recognize him. He looked rough. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by something I can only describe as desperation. Hey man, he started, scratching the back of his head. Can we talk? I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. What do you want? Trevor launched into this rambling apology about how he didn't know Samantha was married when they first started seeing each other. He said she told him we were separated and that I was emotionally abusive, which was laughable, considering who Samantha actually was. He said Samantha had promised him money, my money, and now that she was broke, he was struggling. He had the audacity to ask if I could help him out, since, in his words, she dragged both of us into this mess. I laughed in his face. You've got some nerve coming here, I said. You made your choices, and now you're dealing with the consequences. Don't ever come back. Then I slammed the door. The fact that Trevor thought I'd give him a dime was hilarious. He was just as entitled as Samantha, and I had no sympathy. Samantha, meanwhile, wasn't done trying to crawl back into my life. She called and texted me several times, begging for a second chance. She said she had made a mistake and that she missed us. She even tried to guilt-trip me, saying that she was lost without me and didn't know how to move forward. The worst was when she showed up at my house unannounced. I opened the door to find her standing there, looking disheveled and crying. She said she wanted to talk, that she just needed one chance to explain herself. I didn't let her in. I didn't even entertain the idea. You made your bed, I told her. Now lie in it. Then I closed the door in her face. That was the last time I saw her in person. Over the next few months, Samantha's downfall became the talk of our old social circle. She went from being the glamorous center of attention to a cautionary tale. People who used to fawn over her started distancing themselves, not wanting to be associated with the drama. Her charity friends replaced her with someone else, and the women in her social club stopped inviting her to events. Every now and then, someone would ask me if I'd heard from her. I'd just shake my head and say, nope. Samantha's life now is a shadow of what it once was. The woman who used to flaunt her designer lifestyle and act like she was above everyone else is now scraping by, trying to hold on to whatever dignity she has left. She's no longer the queen of her social circles. She's the cautionary tale everyone whispers about. As for me, I'm at peace. I've learned a lot from this experience. But the biggest takeaway is this: entitlement and greed will destroy you if you let them. Samantha built her life on appearances, and when the facade crumbled, she had nothing left. Thanks, Reddit, for letting me get this off my chest. Your feedback and support mean a lot. Stay